Good afternoon. My name is Bernd Stahl, and I will shortly start to give a presentation here on the topic of artificial intelligence for however, there will be a short introduction to my talk. So before I actually go into the middle of the talk, I'll give the organizers a minute to change over to this room to then give a short introduction into the session. Okay, I believe Farnaz is just joining us. Farnaz, do you want to do the introduction to the session?
Hello, I join you. Yes, I'm here. Thank you. No, I think I introduced you, so simply you can start talking.
Okay, right. Okay, so firstly, I would like to start with the usual thank you to the organizers. I'm delighted to be here and talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in a variety of projects, in particular, though, the Sherpa project, which is where the basis of the majority of the work that I'm going to talk about today comes from. Sherpa is an EU project that's been running for a bit over 3 years, and that is going to run for another 5 months or so. And its main aim was to look at the ethical and human rights aspects of AI and big data, of what we called at the time smart information systems. So the title of this presentation, AI for a Better Future, an Ecosystems Perspective on the Ethics of AI and Emerging Digital Technologies, is also the title of a book that I've recently published, and that I've just shared a link to in the chat earlier, so I hope you can see that. It's an open access book, so you can download it for free if you're so inclined. Before I come to the actual content of the talk and the project that underpins it, a quick introduction of where I come from and what we do. So my name is Bernd Stahl, and I'm a professor at De Montfort University. And De Montfort University is in Leicester in the UK. And on this map here, you see where Leicester is located. So we're pretty much in the middle of the country, about 100 miles north of London. So the CCSR, the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility, has been around for quite a while. So we celebrate our 25th anniversary this year. And we've been doing work around ethics and social aspects of computing in general for that quarter of a century. We are currently a relatively large group, so we have about 25 members of staff and a number of national and international research associates and visitors. Those of you who are interested in the ethics of computing may have come across the Ethicom conference series, which was actually started when the center launched. So we've been running that conference series for 25 years, or we've been closely associated with it. We also have a couple of journals, the Information Ethics Communication Society, and then the Journal of Responsible Technology, which I edit, which is an Elsevier open access journal, which you may want to Google. And we do a lot of funded projects. So we currently have a bunch of projects from the, mostly funded by the European Commission, but also some from the EPSRC, which is the Engineering Physical Science Research Council, the Economic and Social Science Research Council in the UK, and other funders. Right, so that's where I'm from. And now a little bit about the background of the project. So Sherpa started in 2018. We wrote the proposal in 2017, so that was a little bit before the big hype around ethics and AI hit the airwaves. So what we tried to do and what we were aiming to do is come to a better understanding of what ethical and human rights aspects arise, in particular with regards to what we call smart information systems. And by that, we mean systems that employ parts of artificial intelligence techniques and big data analytics. But the point being that these systems typically are broader than just a particular technique. So we organized the project around a number of challenges, and I'll quickly go through those. So the first challenge is the question of what actually are those issues. So what are the ethical and human rights aspects of these smart information systems? And in order to come to an understanding of that, we've done a set of case studies, and I'll show you in a minute what those were about. We've developed a set of scenarios. We've looked at the technical side, in particular cyber threats, and we looked at the literature around ethical and philosophical issues, as well as human rights questions. So to give you an overview of the case studies we've looked at, so we've picked 10 different organizations that made use of smart information systems in some way, and we try to spread those geographically as well as on a content level as broadly as possible. So we looked at specific technologies such as the Internet of Things. We looked at application areas from government, agriculture, research, and smart cities. And we looked at both public sector and private sector organizations. So we looked at insurances, at retail, at manufacturing, as well as energy and communication. So I'm not going to say a lot about the detail of these case studies. If you're interested, you can have a look at those on our website. If you Google us, it's project-sherpa.eu, where all of these case studies are published. In addition to these case studies, which looked at particular technologies currently in use, we also tried to look a little bit beyond the current horizon, and we tried to find out what are likely future uses. And we tried to pick some that were already in the public domain, that are where there was discussion around them, but which we expected to become more prominent, more relevant in the near future. So we looked at, that was the wrong direction. We looked at predictive policing, the future of warfare, deep fakes. We looked at smart systems in education and autonomous vehicles, and try to figure out what are changes that we can expect and what consequences will those have for ethics and human rights. We understand, however, that it's just not just us in the project who are working on these things, but there's a very broad debate, which is at this point, of course, international and very policy oriented. So we try to make sure that we have a broad range of stakeholder representation within the project. So we have a stakeholder board with about 30 representatives of key stakeholder groups. We did a bunch of interviews. We had an online survey, and we did a Delphi study just to get a broader view of the landscape out there. We then explored possible ways of responding to these challenges, so to the ethical and human rights challenges of smart systems. We put this all into the workbook, which is basically just a page on the website, but the substantive bits of analysis we did was we developed a set of guidelines for researchers and developers of these technologies. We looked at possible regulatory options. We looked at standardization potential. We specifically developed terms of reference for a regulator in this space. And we also looked at technical options, in particular with regards to security questions. Then the fourth challenge for us was to figure out which ones of these things actually may work and how may they work. And in order to do this, we had a testing and validation stage, which mostly revolved around a set of focus groups, where we try to work with people who make use of various types of systems in order to find out how our recommendations and suggestions would work. And then finally, we had the challenge of how do we translate this into practice. And we had the usual dissemination communication activities, which you find in any EU project. But I think what sets us apart in the Sherpa project from most other projects is that we, on the one hand, had an artistic representation. So we not only did a lot of academic research, but we also developed a set of videos, and we had an artist in residence who did a number of projects alongside the project to find different ways of expressing the issues that we found. All of this, again, is available on the website. And then finally, we had an advocacy arm. So the idea was that from the outside, we planned to bring our findings and recommendations to stakeholders, to policymakers, to decision makers in industry at the end of the project, which is the process, or the stage of the process that we're in right now. Right. So that is sort of the structure of the Sherpa project. And what I will now give you is sort of a high-level overview of what are the key recommendations and how we come up with them. So what are our insights and how do those inform what we think can be done at this point? So let's start by, and now I'm going to use more the terminology of AI, simply because it's very prominent at the moment, and the concept of smart information systems hasn't been as visible as AI. So what is AI? And I guess many of you can cite various different definitions. So this is one that came from the white paper by the European Commission, which is very broad. Right? It's around technologies that combine data, algorithms, and computing power. And then you have more academically motivated definitions such as this one, and I could have picked any of a large number of others, which look at particular aspects of functionality that AI is supposed to engender. So memory, perception, emotion, and so on. Now, the one question before, I'll come back to the concept of AI in a minute, but one question that we found important in order to get a handle on the ethical side of those technologies is, well, what are these technologies used for? So what are the purposes that we can find stated for the use of AI? And I think the most prominent and most widely used one is this one. AI allows us to increase efficiency, to optimize, to make things faster, better, and so on. And in the end, in a commercial context, that means it leads to and supports profit maximization. So this, I think, is the dominant one, but there are other purposes. One that you can also find quite frequently is the idea that AI is used for social control. So you have, as a primary example of that, the Chinese social credit scoring, but there are other examples where the idea behind the employment of AI is to make sure that people do or act in a way that is foreseen and planned. So Zubov's suggestion of the surveillance capitalism falls in, at least partly, in this category. And then finally, and this is where the concept of ethics, we say you can also use AI for the purposes of human flourishing, to allow people to achieve what they want to achieve, to live up to their potential. So these three different purposes are not necessarily contradictory. So I'm not saying that you can do only one and not the other. And in fact, the current situation, COVID, indicates that on occasion it may very well be required to have social control in order to facilitate human flourishing. Similarly, you can make an argument that you need efficiency, that you need profit maximization in order to provide the well-being that is the basis for human flourishing. So I'm not saying that they're contradictory, but I'm saying is that you can have different emphasis. And we're suggesting that the focus on flourishing is, or provides the emphasis on ethical components. Back to the question of what is AI. This is a slide or a figure that is taken from the publication that you see here on the left. This was a publication coming out of the Elsevier publishing house, and you probably know that Elsevier is one of the biggest publishers in the world. They also own the Scopus database, which is one of the biggest academic databases, and they did an internal piece of work to identify what exactly it is that people talk about when they use the term AI. And they did an enormous amount of literature review. They came up with, I think, 800 something keywords that categorize AI, and then they clustered those keywords to find out what are the key aspects of it. And the figure on the right, the corona around the circle, this is a set of those keywords, and you probably can't read them. Just an indication of how many there are. And then the strands in the middle are the various main clusters. And you have things that you would expect, such as machine learning, image recognition, natural language processing, but also things like fuzzy logic. And the interesting point here is that there is no completely shared agreement on what it is. So there is no set of concepts that all AI researchers would necessarily agree to is what they're doing. In addition to looking at the academic literature, they also looked at other types of discourses around AI. So they looked at textbooks, they looked at the media, and they looked at policy discourses to find out what people in other types of discourses talk about. And it turns out that there's very little overlap between them. So what that means is that the concept of AI is problematic in that it's not easily defined. So what we try to do then is cluster and understand AI in ways that are suitable for an ethical analysis. So we think that there are three groups of users of the term of AI, which are of ethical relevance. On the one hand, we have the focus on a specific type of AI, in particular machine learning, the narrow AI, which corresponds to the majority of the recent successes of the AI discourse, but which isn't everything that's out there. Secondly, there are a lot of references to what we call here converging socio-technical systems. So these are systems where you have AI techniques, these may be machine learning or other narrow AI techniques, but the reference is not to the technology per se, but to the socio-technical system within which they are employed. So this is where we're looking at things like credit scoring in banking or autonomous vehicles or so on. So you have a narrow AI technology, but it is embedded in a broader environment. And then finally, we have general AI or artificial general intelligence or good old AI or whatever you want to call it. So these technologies that are truly human-like, that don't exist at the moment, but that have a very strong presence in the discourse. So for each of these types of technologies, you have particular characteristics which translate over into particular ethical concerns. So machine learning, certainly the deep neural network type of technologies we see are typically described as having a lack of transparency, so they're opaque. Because they're changing the internal states of this, the models can change, they may be unpredictable, and they require large amounts of data, so they have big data requirements. The socio-technical systems have or are characterized by the social impact that they have or are expected to have. They are seen as being manipulative, so they steer human behavior in particular directions, and they are perceived to be autonomous in the sense that they act on humans without necessarily having user interaction or guidance at all times. And then finally, general AI has characteristics and raises questions around some of the very fundamental questions of AI and even more broadly around what counts as intelligence, what does it mean to be human, and how do our interactions with systems change our perceptions of reality. So if these three clusters are ways of describing the concept of AI, then you can use those to cluster the ethical discussion as well. So you have, for machine learning, specific issues that arise of them. For the socio-technical systems, there are more broader, more general questions around what it means to live in a digital world. And then we have what we call here metaphysical questions or philosophical questions around artificial general intelligence. Examples of those would be, so for machine learning and specific narrow AI, we have questions such as bias coming out of biased data sets, corresponding and resulting discrimination issues. We have questions of data protection and security of the systems themselves. With regards to living in the digital world, we have broader questions around the autonomy both of the system and the autonomy of humans who make use of it. There are questions around who holds power, both economic and political, how does the use of technology change power distributions. There are issues such as the future of warfare, who benefits, who pays, who's responsible for the risks, and who gets hit when things go wrong. And then finally, for the metaphysical questions, we have issues such as, is there a possibility of superintelligence, the singularity? Is there a possibility that human nature will change fundamentally because of these systems? Now, for some of these questions, there's a lot of research around specific remedies and ways of addressing them. So there are technical, legal, and other remedies for narrow AI. Now, explainable AI would be an example of the sort of activity that are put in this category. With regards to general questions about living in the digital world, these are really issues that are broader and that call for policy and political interaction. So these are questions where you look at the impact of intellectual property right, or how do we use taxation to ensure a fair society. And then finally, we have very fundamental and philosophical and long-term questions around the nature of reality, which may not be open to resolution at all, but which are still quite prominent in the discourse. So that was an attempt to cluster the ethical issues. Now, what are the ways of dealing with them? How can they be mitigated? And I'm suggesting that there are 4 different groups of mitigation strategies, but this is one of many possible ways of structuring it. So I'm suggesting that we can look at policy and regulatory options. We can look at things that can be done in an organization. There are technical options, and there are suggestions on what individuals can do. So with regards to policy and regulation, on the one hand, you have the possibility of having specific regulation around AI, and in the EU, you will probably be aware that there's been recently a proposal published for a regulation on AI, and that is sort of the primary example of this first box. But it's not just specific regulation. There are also other types of regulatory interventions from existing law, for example, the application of human rights law with a specific emphasis on particular technologies, competition law, liability law, intellectual property law, you name them. All of them have relevance to AI. And then there are options of creating new types of bodies, such as a new regulator. So that's on the policy level. For companies and organizations, there are various different activities that they can engage in, either within the company or as industry groups. And you see examples here of activities which most companies already have, which may be relevant for AI. So risk management, impact assessment, quality management, corporate social responsibility, all of these may have implications for AI. There are a bunch of technical proposals. So there are suggestions on how to ensure the security of systems, which is relevant with regards to data protection. There are various technical standardization committees and activities that are going on at the moment. There are suggestions for design guidelines that you can use in order to implement or increase sensitivity to ethical concerns in AI. And finally, there are structures that are aimed at individuals that help them either because they are technical experts and developers, or because they're users, or have some other sort of role that can help them deal with possible ethical issues of AI. So we have a ton of framework at this point. There are professional bodies, there are different types of methodologies, and so on. So now we have the categories of AI and the ethical issues. We've looked at mitigation strategies, and just as the last set of topics worth exploring is the question of who are the stakeholders. And I'm suggesting we can distinguish 3 different stakeholder groups. Again, this is not claiming to be comprehensive and the only way of carving up the world, but it is one way that I find plausible. So on a policy level, you have all sorts of policy actors, from nation states to international actors, EU, OECD, UN, UNESCO, you name them. All of them play a role here. But you also have policy implementing bodies, such as funding bodies, such as regulators, such as ethics bodies, all of which have a role to play here. In terms of organizations, you have some very dominant ones. Those are the organizations that hold the big data, that hold the technical capabilities. So these are the big internet companies or other big tech companies. But they're not the only ones. You also have companies that make use of their services, that deploy them. You have companies that act as mediators. And then you have other types of organizations that have different roles to play, such as professional bodies, media organizations, education bodies, and so on. And then finally, there are various types of individuals who, of course, also make up the other stakeholder groups, but who can have individual roles as either technical experts, developers, as users, as activists who try to push particular agendas, or I think that's also important to remember, as non-users, as people who don't want to use, who have no interest in AI, but may still be affected by the way it's rolled out and changes the way the society works. So where does all of this leave us? It leaves us with a position of complexity, and there are lots of different ways of carving up the definition, the ethical issues, the mitigation strategies, the people who might be responsible, and there's very clearly no magical bullet. So there's no way you can say we do this and that takes care of the ethics of AI. We have a very complex distribution of responsibility, many of which already exist. And at the same time, things change dynamically because of technical progress. So technology changes over time. So what we probably need then is some sort of intelligent mix of ways of addressing the ethics of AI. And the way we've thought about this within the Sherpa project and which informs our recommendations is that we take seriously this metaphor of the ecosystem. And you will have come across the reference to AI ecosystems. This is prominently taken up by a number of policymakers. The European Commission, in its white paper, used that metaphor of AI very prominently. But it's also visible in other policy documents and in a lot of funding documents. You can find. So in the UK, I'm certain that there are various ways of talking about the AI ecosystem. How can we make it better? And what we've done here is we try to take this metaphor seriously and try to think about what does this mean in terms of ethics? What does it mean in terms of obligations, activities, structures that would help us to ensure that ethical considerations are taken into account? So what we're suggesting here is that we are looking at an AI ecosystem that is conducive to human flourishing. And how can we get there? How would that be possible? The starting point here would be to look at what is an ecosystem, what are characteristics of an ecosystem, and how can those characteristics then inform what can and should be done. So ecosystems have a number of characteristics. One of them is that that their boundaries are not necessarily obvious and clear. So it's not they are difficult to determine, and they can also change over time. Ecosystems are open, so you can have members of ecosystems who leave them. You can also have new members join them. There's a strong emphasis on evolution as one of the reasons why ecosystems change. And it's probably worth saying something about the literature that this comes from. So we looked at a lot of literature on the innovation ecosystems discourse, where the idea is that so this is already one step removed from the biology ecosystem literature where the concept comes from, and it's already applied this metaphor to technical systems. And we've now taken this and tried to apply this particularly to the AI and ethics discourse. So this evolution, the concept of evolution as a driver of change, is prominent in the innovation ecosystems literature. So there's change, which ecosystems and the ecosystems literature is trying to explain. But the change is not necessarily always conflictual. There can also be co-evolution. There's mutual learning of the participants of an ecosystem. The actors within an ecosystems are mutually interdependent, and the relationship between them tend to be complex. So the main takeaway here is that it's very difficult to determine straightforward linear causalities within ecosystems. If you want to interact with an ecosystem, the assumption that you can simply have a simple cause-effect relationship is typically misleading. So if we now want to interact with an ecosystem, we want to steer an ecosystem. So the question is, what intervention would be possible and how would they be structured? And we've come up with a set of requirements for interventions that we believe need to be met in order for a successful engagement with the ecosystem. So on the one hand, they need to be clearly delimited. It needs to be clear what is the ecosystem, what's in, what's out, and that covers various different types of boundaries, geographical, conceptual, but also technical. What type of AI am I looking at? What type of ecosystems am I trying to affect here? Secondly, there's a question of the knowledge base. So the ecosystem must contain a certain level of knowledge, and the members of this ecosystem must be able to access this knowledge in order for the ecosystems to be able to intentionally act or move in a particular direction. So the knowledge base clearly includes technical knowledge. So there has to be expertise on the particular AI in question, but it goes beyond that. It has to have conceptual knowledge. It has to understand what is ethics, what are human rights, how do these things hang together. There have to be procedural ways of interacting between different types of ecosystems stakeholders. And the ecosystem has to be in a position to maintain and update its capacities, its knowledge base. And then finally, there need to be considerations of governance in the ecosystem. So the governance structure of such ecosystems needs to be flexible and adaptive because of the dynamic nature of the ecosystems by definition. they have to be able to learn, and they have to take over a higher level view of responsibilities within it, which is what we call meta-responsibility. Right, so taking these requirements, we now ask the question, where next? How can we take this forward? And requirements are the basis of our recommendations. The vision, what we're trying to achieve here, is the integration of ethics as an integral part of AI. So often you see a distinction between scientific assessment and the ethical assessment. And what we're saying here is that that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But for AI to be excellent, it doesn't just have to be scientifically and technically excellent. It actually has to think about what the possible consequences for human beings are. And that needs to be part of the assessment. So this is our vision. And we're trying to think about a world where excellent AI and smart information systems support human flourishing by safeguarding human rights and integrating ethical concerns. And we've suggested that this requires 3 different types of interventions. And these correspond very closely with the requirements that I showed you a minute ago. So on the one hand, there needs to be conceptual clarity around what is the ecosystem. So the delimitation needs to be clear. And that's conceptual, that may be technical, that may be any other aspect that determines what's in and out. Secondly, there have to be governance structures. We are suggesting that there should be a regulatory framework, and the European Commission, of course, has just launched its proposal for what that might look like, but there may be others. We are suggesting that there should be a body that is specifically responsible for AI, and we've called this the EU agency. Sherpa is an EU project, and therefore we've written this for an EU audience. You think you could also use the same type of reasoning elsewhere. And we're suggesting that on an organizational level, there should be a role or post of somebody who holds responsibility for the ethical aspects of AI. And we've suggested that that could be somebody called an AI ethics officer. So this would be an organizational level role. And then finally, with regards to the knowledge, we think that there are particular types of knowledge that need to be developed. So we're suggesting, for example, that AI impact assessments should be developed and shared. We're suggesting, and we've actually developed a methodology of ethics by design for AI, which can be used to integrate ethical concerns throughout the development stages of the system. We're suggesting that there need to be training and education across the educational pathways, so from school all the way to PhDs, and professional development as well. We're suggesting that ethical aspects need to be explicitly included into standardization activities. And we have suggested some security measures, in particular for particular types of vulnerability and attacks. So these are our main recommendations, and you find a lot more detail on each of them if you look at the recommendation page on our website. It is important to keep in mind that these are we're trying to take a systems view, so you shouldn't pick up individuals of those and pick and mix, but they should actually be thought in conjunction. So the different groups of recommendations are mutually dependent. So the delimitation of the system is required in order for the knowledge base to be determined, but the knowledge base also can inform what we think about the delimitation. The governance structures can incentivize the development of the knowledge base. The knowledge base, in turn, can inform what the governance structures would look like. The governance structures would consider the delimitation. So these different groups are mutually dependent. But the same is also true for the individual recommendations. So a regulatory framework, for example, might mandate the creation of an AI agency or an AI ethics officer. An ethics by design approach would require or might include AI impact assessment. It might require specific training and certification pathways. It might build on particular standards and require or suggest particular types of security measures. And then there's also relationships between those individual recommendations in the different groups. So an AI ethics officer presumably would require a particular type of training and education. A regulatory framework might call for an impact assessment, and so on. So this is the look of these, or a different perspective on the same recommendations. So this is from our website. where we try to put this all into a little graphical representation here. And I think the main point here is that these different types of recommendations actually form a consistent whole, which should be considered collectively. Right, and with that, I come to the end of the presentation. If you found any of this interesting, this is the book which I've recently published, where these ideas are developed in a lot more detail. It's publicly available for free, so you can download it and read it on your Kindle or in whichever other way, which gives a lot more of the background, which I can't give you in half an hour's talk. And I think with that, I'll stop, and I'll be happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Bernd, for this interesting talk. I really enjoyed, and it was a really good perspective on what we should do and what we are and how we should get to the right place. First of all, I would like to apologize for the confusion in the beginning of the talk. I introduced you in the previous backstage, and I expected when I come, then the talk has started, so it was a confusion. So I apologize, you and also the other participants. So I would like to encourage all participants or our attendees to write questions in the chat. Then we can actually, I'm not sure. There is also a raise hand feature. I'm not sure how it works. But then I can read the questions and we can discuss together. Yeah, okay. By Matthew, we have a great keynote. Thank you, Bernd, again. Matthew mentioned that I often hear criticism around this kind of work, that ethical problems are people problems, not tech problems, sorry. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how much of ethical tech is social problem and how much is technical problem and can be fixed by improving or supplementing development processes.
That is a valid observation. I agree with the premise that tech problems are often not tech or ethical problems may have a root in tech, but they are not fundamentally tech problems. That's most often true, I would say. There may well be exceptions to that. There may be some specifically related to a particular technology, but I think the vast majority of the problems are socio-technical problems. So I think it's, coming back to what I said earlier, this idea of the socio-technical system is to move away from the attempt to locate the ethics in the technology, but look at what the technology does within the social context in which it is used. And in that sense, I think the vast majority of problems are, maybe all of them, are socio-technical problems. Now, the question is, can they be fixed with a tech fix? Right? So is there a way to addressing them through technical measures? And I would argue that for some, this may well be the case to a limited extent. So in terms of AI, and probably the most widely discussed AI ethics issue is that of biases. Right? You have biases in the data set, and then you're disadvantaged because of your skin color or your gender or whatever. And I think that is something where it is plausible to assume that there may be technical fixes, at least to some degree. So you might be able to determine whether the training data contains particular biases already. And by highlighting this, you may be able to avoid this being perpetuated in the later application of the technology. So I think that there may well be, or there's definitely a good reason to assume that there will be technical solutions to some aspects, or at least technical input into the social solutions of those aspects. However, I think most of them are much bigger and really are, the solutions are much more likely to sit on a societal, on a global level even. And I'm thinking here about the questions of distributions of riches or risk and benefits. The fact that Google makes billions and billions and billions, whereas most of us just donate our money for free. That's not really a technical problem. Now, this is a problem of the economic system in which we operate. So I think very briefly the answer is yes, there's some technical aspect of the solution, but the vast majority of them are really social and in many cases even political solutions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. We have a question from Marcus Borg. I like the way you clustered the ethical dimension connected to AI. How do you see them relating to each other? Is there a priority somehow or a place to focus first?
So yeah, let me go back to the slide on that, if I can get that quickly. So it's the three different groups of issues. There are more things to be pressed here than I thought there would be. This one. So this is where we have the three different types of ethical concerns, and the question is, what's the relationship between them and what are the priorities? And I think what you see in practice is that the majority of the discussion at the moment hinges around the ones at the top right. So it's about the specific issues of particular types of technologies, in particular, what does machine learning do to us and what can we do about that? If you look at the definition of AI in the draft regulation or the proposed regulation by the Commission, now it's a bit fuzzy, but they have machine learning as the first term in there. So that's what we're interested in. And I guess the reason for that is that this is where we assume that there may be solutions, that there may be specific ways we can do about them. Now, I think the relationship between set 1 and set 2 here, so the specific machine learning issues and the broader questions around the socio-technical systems that we surround ourselves with, I don't think you can actually make the clear distinction that I've suggested here. I think they spill over into one another. So bias and discrimination clearly are also socio-technical broader systems, and you may well find reasons for some of the issues I list below, such as autonomy of the system and the characteristics of machine learning and so on. So they're not as analytically separate as I've suggested here. I do think that coming back to the question of how could one prioritize which ones are the most important one, I get the feeling that it's really around what people are most comfortable with, what they like to talk about. So I think that the computer scientists tend to like the top right here. I think you find social scientists and economists who like the bottom right, who look at what happens in the real world, and I think you find a lot of philosophers who really like the bit on the left here. The fundamental philosophical questions. Is any of them more important or less important than the other? Now, difficult to say. So there are some people who say we're wasting our time talking about the metaphysical question. As others say, well, actually the opposite is true, because even if they have a very small probability of being realized, if a super intelligent beast at some point gets rid of humanities, now that's a much bigger ethical issue than any discrimination we can ever think of. So I don't think we can prioritize them. I think they all have merit in their own right. I think in practice, though, certainly on the policy level, the attempt is to look at interventions that are doable, and I think that filters to some degree what people focus on.
Great, thank you so much. Then we have a question from Başak Aydemir. Thank you for the keynote. How can we incorporate ethics education and training in our curricula? We usually have dedicated 1 or 2 hour session per semester, and then do not mention ethics much. How do you think we can manage this problem?
So that's a really old problem in ethics and technology in general. So I've been in this field for about 30 years now, and the same, you could have asked the very same question 30 years ago, and I don't think much has really fundamentally changed. I think that there are two basic positions on that. One is you have to have ethics as a separate core expertise that forms part of the education, which means you have in university studies you would have a module on ethics or professionalism. And the other position is it has to be integrated. It has to be part of the technical development. So when you learn programming languages, when you learn systems design, you need to incorporate the ethical concerns there. I think both of them are valid to some degree. I think I have a little sympathy for both positions. And I think that's the other part of the question here is, in practice, it doesn't seem to make much of a difference a lot of the time. And the reason why that is the case, I believe, is this distinction between ethics and technology. And if you think back of our vision that I suggested here, it's the integration of ethics in the concept of excellence that is only going to make a difference. And in terms of education, what that would mean is that ethical considerations would have to be part of the assessment. If you write, for example, finally a project in computer science, and people develop a sort of system, if you have an assessment grid that doesn't cover the ethical and social aspects, then basically you wasted your time. And the point being is that we have to think those two together. We shouldn't distinguish between ethics and scientific excellence. We should say that scientific excellence includes ethics. And if that message comes across, then I think the question of how to integrate that into the curriculum is much more easily answered, because then you simply make sure that it is covered in the curriculum just as any other aspect of technical excellence that you would typically require is covered. So they can become modules, they can be parts of it, but I think it's important that that ethics is not seen as an add-on, as a bolt-on. It's a bit like you used to have the argument around security in computer science 15 years ago. Now security as a bolt-on. I don't think we do that anymore. I think everybody has now understood that security shouldn't be a bolt-on. It's really crucial to the success of the enterprise. And I think we should simply follow the same route with regards to ethics and say, if you don't think about these things early on, and if you don't take them seriously, even if there are no simple answers to them, we have not done our job properly.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Now we have a question from Rogart Heldal. What about the countries that do not follow these kinds of ethics? Will they get some extra benefits, get further in AI? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, so it's the question of the free riders, and whether, I mean, in terms of actual geopolitical discussion, this of course refers to, on the one hand, America, and on the other hand, China, as sort of the big AI powerhouses, and who have potentially different views on ethics, and in particular also on regulation and enforcement of ethics. So if you take the example of its proposed regulation, the argument that any EU representative would put forward is that what we're trying to do here is set good standards, establish good practice, and require thereby other countries to increase the game as well. So they would argue that this really, we have an example of that through data protection in the EU, where the GDPR has now developed or made mandatory fairly strict standards that need to be complied with, and that in practice it hasn't been detrimental to European AI providers or European computer or data providers, right? That companies from other bits of the world that want to do business with the EU actually have to adopt these principles, and by doing that, drive up the standards within their organizations. And primary example of that is probably Apple, who claim to be GDPR compliant and just say this is great, and we want to be GDPR compliant because we take the data protection of our customers seriously. And I think you could make a similar argument for AI. So by being more ethically aware, by being more reflective of human rights impacts, you will come up with systems that will be advantageous, that consumers will like more, because it actually takes their concerns into account. Now, whether that is true or not, and whether that will happen or not, is of course an empirical question. I don't know. I think that's the hope, that's the aspiration. If it turns out that cheap providers who have absolutely no concerns on ethics, data protection, or any of those things come into the market and are successful, then that hypothesis will be severely tested. I would be fairly optimistic, however, that this is not just about Europeans try to push their own values, but actually the recognition of human rights, that we don't want to be discriminated against, that we do want to remain autonomous and so on, that these are universal concerns that people have anywhere. And therefore that establishing this sort of principles and standards will at least lead to a political push for companies and governments to incorporate these concerns.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Actually, we have an online question by Graham Lee. He questioned that, actually he mentioned that individual level or even organizational level intervention seems easier to implement than governance and society level. And this system approach requires all three. What is the pathway to an EU-wide, for example, agency regulatory framework?
So yes, you're of course right that the way to influence those different levels differs vastly. So having national legislation requires a completely different process from having a different types of methodology in a company. Having said that, I think again the proposed regulation is a good example of how these things come together. So when we started the project, we had no idea that this was before the high-level expert group was convened. That's when the whole AI ethics and DI debate was very much at its beginning. And now, 3 years later, it's matured immensely. And what I think this demonstrates is that these different aspects do develop in conjunction. So we had numerous interactions with the European Commission during the process of drafting the regulation. I'm not going to claim any authorship or causal relationship, but we did certainly have exchanges with them and try to follow the thinking of the people within the Commission who wrote these, wrote first the white paper, now the draft regulation. And in that, to take the example of the agency that you also pick up in the question, in these discussions we had with them, we could observe the change of thinking within the Commission over time. So in the beginning, they were very much opposed to having an agency. They now say, we don't want a regulator, we don't want to stifle innovation, we don't want to impose cost on anybody. If you look at it now, it's actually much more heavy-handed than I thought it was going to be. So they have this requirement of an ex-ante impact assessment. It's not called impact assessment, it's called something else. And they're also suggesting the European, which is not an agency, which is not a regulator, which is a much more loosely assembled group. However, it is, and I think the thinking within the Commission is that it may well turn into a regulator if that turns out to be useful. So, and then this AI board, which is part of the regulation, will be the gatekeeper for some of the aspects that we've also suggested. So they will, they're meant to be the gatekeepers of identifying what the ethical issues are, what requirements are going to be met for high risk type of AI. So these things will then develop in conjunction, as we've suggested here. So this systemic approach actually, in practice, so far, at least in Europe, seems to work.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the answer. Actually, we have maybe similar, but let's read the question. Deepika wrote, thank you for your great keynote. My question is about governance. When and how often should an ethical officer interact with the tech stakeholders?
So the idea of the AI ethics officer is that this is going to be somebody who is located within a company. And we thought this in parallel to the data protection officer, which you may be aware of, which is a requirement under the GDPR. So the idea is that this would be somebody who, within a company, bridges the gap between the technical and the externally facing side. So they would have to have the understanding and the knowledge to be able to deal with the computer scientists, with the systems developers, to understand what the system actually does, so what the data requirements are, how the data is manipulated. At the same time, they need to understand what the external concerns are, what customers think about it, what external stakeholders may think about it. So the answer to how often does the tech or the ethics officer interact with the stakeholders, well, that would be their job. That would be the core of what they do. They would have to negotiate this relationship between the company and its environment with regards to not only, but to a large extent, to what ethical concerns are out there. How could the technology being developed in the system, in the company, how could that be put to use? What the consequences would be of the deployment of the socio-technical assemblage that you have out there once it's there. So the tech officer, the AI ethics officer, would have to think about these things, and not just think about them, but work within the company and work within internal and external stakeholders to come to some sort of understanding of what the position is and what could be done about it. Now, I think that raises lots of interesting questions of whether that would lead to consensus. Now, does that mean we all agree on the problems in the end and what to do about them? Probably not. But I think that having such a position would really help companies, and we're thinking in particular about big companies. So this is not something that an SME would be likely to have, but the Googles and the Microsofts of this world, they probably should have them and probably do have them at this point. So this is a position which sort of stimulates discussion within the company and beyond the company's borders. And I think that's really what's required here.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. We have another question from Ryan Ali. Thanks, Bernd. May we think about internalizing ethical consideration in designers and SE students? Sometimes it's not a matter of lack of knowledge, but rather attitude toward the whole things. Example, game and gambling sites, designers might say, it is the play responsibility to stay in control, not us. Although sites can indeed give control to users, empathy and behavior change approaches we use in inclusive design might be promising here. What is your perspective on this question?
I fully agree. So the question of whether knowledge drives ethical behavior is an old one. Now this goes back to Plato and beyond. Traditionally and often philosophers tend to believe that if you just know what's good, you'll do the good. But in practice, that's not true. However, if you don't know what's good, then it makes it even harder to do the right thing. So I do think that there is an important part to be played by knowledge dissemination, by teaching and education. But I agree with Ryan that that's not going to be the whole thing. Now, I think ethics, but we should also be clear about limitations of ethics. Now, ethics isn't actually politics. Ethics doesn't change the world. You can't force people to be ethical, partly because it would be very difficult to define what that means in the first place. You can't force people to want to be ethical. Right? So there is sort of the assumption that people would like to do the right thing. And in order for them to do that, they have to have certain knowledge. And they also have to have certain motivations. So if you have the games developer who just puts the responsibility on the individual user, then, well, on the one hand, this may actually be a considered ethical position. So they may live in a world where they believe very strongly in individual responsibility as an enabler of human flourishing, and they would say, well, for me, it's flourishing to gamble as much as I want, and therefore I would like to facilitate that for other people as well, which I think is very much an argument that could be made. In that case, then I think the question would really be, so how do you think about the consequences of that? And how do you square your assumption about what's right and wrong with the consequences of what you do? In the end, it may come down to saying, well, you think that's right and I disagree. And then I think that's sort of the limitations of ethics, in the sense ethics can say what the possible arguments would be. It can try to clarify positions. But it can't force anybody to do anything. If now there is a point where society as a whole thinks we should limit gambling, then that would be a question of legislation, of political intervention. That's no longer a question of ethics. Ethics does play an important role, though, in clarifying what the position and the options are. But ethics doesn't force people, it doesn't make decisions.
Great, thank you so much. And I have a question what could be our responsibility as a researcher in this play?
So I think a key aspect here is to be aware of the fact that that these ethical, human rights related broader societal concerns are there, that they're valid, that they're relevant, and that they should form part of the entire research and development life cycle. So this should be something that should be considered at proposal writing stage, at proposal conception stage. Now, when you do your research, you start out with thinking about, well, what would I do? What knowledge gap do I plug? And even that question is already a value-laden question. It's one that you can't just ask without considering what the social implications are. So I think that as a researcher, the awareness that these are questions worth considering, and that researchers and developers actually have a role in addressing, is important. I'm probably preaching to the converted here. I think if people who don't have that position probably wouldn't spend an hour listening to me here in this workshop. But I think the important point is that we're never just researchers. We also have other types of positions. We are also, in many cases, teachers. We are citizens of the society we live in. We are friends. We are people of other social networks. And I think it's important that the public perception of us as experts on technology means that we also have a duty in that role as experts to communicate to the public at large, to people we talk with in the pub, in the club, or wherever we go, to make sure that we signal that we realize that these are important issues worthy of discussion and consideration. So I think it's sort of a broader human level responsibility, not just the responsibility of a researcher.
Yes, that's completely right. Yes, exactly. Great. Thank you so much for your answers. Any other questions if you have? Okay. We receive one point from Ryan also. He mentioned that in software engineering, ethics is often seen as quality requirement or part of a compliance process. Still, it seems it needs to be more like a continuous process due to emerging properties and context change. Maybe we may rethink ethics in software engineering to become like customer service. That could be ongoing feedback channel, which then actually relocalization and adaptability in the design, right?
Yes, absolutely. I agree that. I mean, there is sort of a tradition of putting ethics into the requirements process, and this is so value-based design and the ethics by design proposals that we've made actually fall in that category, where the idea is that you think about this early. So you think about in your requirements analysis where ethical concerns might arise, and you try to then integrate that into the methodology to make sure that they're considered as you go on. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I do agree with Ryan here that it's not good enough to just leave it there. So it's not like you've done your ethics in the requirement and the compliance part of the process, and that's it. Now, ethics done, thank you very much, never think about it. And that's partly to do with the what they've called logical malleability of computing. So these things can just be used for various different purposes beyond what was initially foreseen, and therefore the idea must be that that there will be a process which looks at possible consequences of use after the end of the development process. Now, there's an interesting question of who is responsible for that, because the software engineer will probably in many cases say, well, I've done my bit, I've written my code, it's out there, it works, thank you very much. So the responsibilities may lie somewhere else. And indeed, again, coming back to the regulation, the proposed regulation, that has a requirement of what they call market surveillance. So the idea is that if a company produces an AI system and they put it in the market, they have a duty to actually look at what happens when it's used in practice. So this idea has been taken up by the European Commission. Again, there's an empirical question of will this work, will it not work? I think it's modeled a bit on the pharmaceutical model, where drug companies are required to follow the consequences of drug use throughout the life cycle of the drug. And I think the same applies here. So I think we're going to be cut off in 30 seconds, right?
Yeah, that's exactly.
I agree with you.
We really enjoyed your talk, your keynote, and also the question and discussion. That was really, really great. And we have just 20 seconds until this session is closed, so it's better that not to be cut. And I would after that we will be in a coffee session, the coffee session, yeah, and would be happy to see you there all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. See you around.
See you.